Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. Haunted pages and flickering screens, the unsettling truths behind children's classics. A gust of wind rustled through a dimly lit library, its ancient shelves sagging under the weight of countless volumes, their spines dull with age. A single lamp illuminated the dust motes drifting in the stale air, revealing shelves of old children's stories, battered and beloved. Someone brushing past the shelves might see only nostalgic titles from a gentler era, fairy tales, nursery rhymes, classic cartoon tie-ins, remnants of the innocent wonder that shaped childhoods for generations. But open one of these dog-eared volumes or peer closely into the flickering frames of older cartoons, and a subtler, darker dimension sometimes emerges. Narratives far more disturbing than the pastel covers might suggest. Throughout history, the domain of children's entertainment has been riddled with undertones of violence, sorrow, moral severity, and even veiled cruelty. Though modern retellings in bright colors or sanitized scripts might conceal it, older storylines from the Brothers Grimm or certain vintage cartoons carry quiet reminders that some of the earliest child-friendly stories were anything but gentle. The distance between the cheery, simplified versions we learned from modern media and the original, more unsettling source material can be jarring to discover. And yet, that hidden darkness helps explain why many of these tales endure. They tap into primal fears, universal moral struggles, and the boundary between safety and the unknown. This is the domain of haunted pages and flickering screens, a realm where beloved children's classics reveal a subtle gloom that resonates with deeper anxieties about loss, transformation, or hidden evil lurking behind cheerful masks. Consider the original fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. In their earliest incarnations, these stories served not as purely whimsical bedtime fare, but as cautionary narratives to instruct children about real dangers in a harsh medieval world. Little Red Riding Hood, for instance, was no gentle yarn about a wise grandmother or comedic cunning. Rather, it depicted a horrifying scenario in which a cunning wolf devoured an unsuspecting child and her grandmother, an act reversed only by the violent intervention of a passing woodsman. Even then, the older versions might lack the sanitized rescue. The moral was stark: watch out for cunning predators in the real world. Over centuries, retellers softened the violence, concluding with comedic comeuppance or omitting the devouring scene. The watchers who uncover original transcripts find a chilling account far from today's bright, simplified cartoon. Modern kids might see playful renditions with singing woodland creatures, forgetting that older incarnations hammered home a dire warning about trust. The same pattern emerges in Cinderella, whose earliest versions included stepsisters cutting off parts of their feet to force them into the golden slipper. Or Snow White, featuring a jealous stepmother demanding her stepdaughter's heart in a box for consumption. These grotesque details are absent from the Disney or certain modern illustrated books. But in the original texts, the blood and torment were not illusions, they were the explicit moral currency. The line between horror and moral fable was thin indeed. Even more extreme is the lesser-known story, The Juniper Tree, also from the Grimms, involving a mother figure beheading her stepson, cooking him into a stew, and serving it to the father, culminating in the boy's resurrection as a bird that kills the stepmother with a millstone. Indeed, not exactly the kindly bedtime reading one might expect. But these tales served as mirrors to the brutal realities of survival in older epochs, where violence or famine was more immediate and moral lessons had to be hammered in forcibly. Over time, publishers and educators decided children needed simpler, gentler versions, forging the sanitized releases we see today. Yet that older darkness never vanished. It remains an undercurrent, recognized by scholars or by those who venture back to read original transcripts. The watchers of these older forms discover that behind the sugar-coated modern retellings lurk stories of savage punishments, twisted illusions, and cosmic justice meted out in horrifying ways. But the darkness in children's classics isn't confined to medieval or Renaissance times. Even in the 20th century, certain cartoons or children's programs contained surprisingly eerie subtexts or episodes that left watchers uneasy. For instance, older theatrical cartoons from the 1930s sometimes displayed violent imagery or surreal horror. The black and white Betty Boop or early Mickey Mouse episodes occasionally ventured into nightmarish scenarios, long-limbed ghosts, skeleton dance routines in a crypt, anthropomorphic trees moaning in the wind. Some was comedic, but some carried a disturbing aesthetic reminiscent of silent-era expressionist film. Children might have found them enthralling in a transfixing way, but adult watchers can note the almost macabre stylings. Then there's the iconic mid-20th century Looney Tunes, which, while comedic, featured an underlying brutality in endless comedic violence. The watchers might smile, but the repeated motif of firearms, TNT, and physical harm was an odd foundation for a children's show if taken literally. In earlier eras, these cartoons had fewer boundaries, free to depict gloom or shock within comedic frames. The watchers now see them as an artifact of a time before content guidelines softened the edges. Stepping beyond comedic fare, certain later cartoons from the 1970s or 1980s ventured into surprisingly adult territory. Watership Down, while not exactly a cartoon but an animated film, is often shelved among children's classics due to its anthropomorphic rabbits. But the story is drenched in violence, existential dread, and raw brutality, a stark allegory of power struggles that leaves younger watchers terrified by the savage scenes. Another example is The Secret of NIMH, an animated film full of dark undertones, lab experiments, near sadistic antagonists, and a brooding sense of mortality overshadow the anthropomorphic animal's heroics. Meanwhile, certain episodes of vintage anime or Western cartoons tackled bleak themes like apocalyptic futures or the unstoppable corruption of power, couched behind bright characters or catchy theme songs. Children might not fully absorb the adult-level gloom, but the watchers, returning to these shows decades later, are struck by the intensity of the horror hidden in plain sight. It's not merely the content that disturbs. Some watchers cite the visual design or atmosphere in older children's animation, describing how certain scenes exhibit a deeply unsettling vibe, unearthly color palettes, bizarre sound design, or abrupt shifts in tone. For instance, older episodes of Scooby-Doo might revolve around comedic spookiness, but certain frames show truly ghastly phantoms or cackling mad scientists that teeter on horror's edge. Or in certain lesser-known cartoons, the entire premise or final twist could revolve around bleak revelations. A character turns out to be a ghost all along, or a mirror dimension is waiting to drag the protagonists away. Looking at it from a modern vantage, the watchers see these as glimpses of how children's animation once thrived on more intense or surreal methods, less sanitized by focus group screening. The watchers might find it enthralling or unnerving, aware that childhood innocence in media is a relatively new marketing-based concept, overshadowing the older impetus to weave real moral caution into stories. Furthermore, even iconic family-friendly studios hold skeletons in their creative closets. Disney, for instance, though it systematically brightened the darkest elements of fairy tales for mass consumption, still scattered older or gloom-laden vignettes throughout its earliest feature films. Pinocchio, for instance, includes haunting scenes on Pleasure Island where boys transform into donkeys, an event that resonates with horrifying, almost body horror aspects, if read literally. The watchers note that the donkey transformation is never fully reversed for most kids, leaving them trapped as beasts. Dark subtext indeed. In Fantasia, the Night on Bald Mountain sequence depicts demonic imagery, swirling ghosts, and cosmic evils, quite intense for a children's movie. While recognized as a masterpiece, it's undeniably nightmarish in tone. Or Dumbo, with the infamous pink elephants on parade, a surreal drunken hallucination that kids might find exhilarating or terrifying. Later eras saw less overt darkness, replaced by comedic sidekicks or diluted villains. But the watchers remain acutely aware that the seeds of fear once thrived in these classics, overshadowed now by the brand's squeaky clean reputation. Meanwhile, moving to older textual sources, a wide range of traditional nursery rhymes also carry bleak or unsettling subtext. For instance, Ring a Roses, often associated with the Great Plague, has lines that might reference mass death, though scholars debate the rhyme's origin. Rock-a-bye Baby alludes to a baby perched in a treetop that eventually crashes down. Some watchers interpret that as referencing mortality or the precariousness of infant life in older societies. Jack and Jill, referencing a fall that leads to a head injury, is benign at surface, but might have deeper historical or political undertones. The watchers see a pattern. Children's rhymes historically never shied away from referencing misfortune or violence, albeit couched in rhythmic or comedic forms. Over centuries, those references endured as unexamined tradition because they functioned as caution or moral. The watchers thus find themselves unsettled by how easily we pass these rhymes to toddlers, ignoring the sinister seeds in their lines. Meanwhile, historians explain that these rhymes reflect historical contexts: plague, famine, overshadowing fear of child mortality, compressed into a sing-song format to make them more palatable. Pivoting to more modern times, one might notice a phenomenon of lost episodes or cursed episodes rumored in the corners of internet lore. Stories of certain famous cartoon series having banned episodes that were too disturbing or psychologically scarring for broadcast. Online communities share cryptic references to Episode 001 or Author's Cut featuring horrifying scenes. Typically, these revolve around unsettling animation or a shift in style that jars the viewer, culminating in references to psychological breaks or gore. While many of these claims are recognized as creepypastas, fabrications by internet users seeking to spark an urban legend, some watchers suspect that one or two might be grounded in real, short-lasted experiments by animators or test reels that never made it mainstream. The watchers remain enthralled by the possibility of discovering such an episode hidden in a production archive, unveiling a raw horror that animators once tried to infuse. More rational perspectives note that the animation industry typically vets content thoroughly, making accidental release of truly horrifying sequences unlikely. But the watchers argue that an unscrupulous or misguided animator might have created a segment beyond standard guidelines, resulting in an internal ban. The concept remains mostly legend, fueling the impression that behind the bright facade of children's shows, an undercurrent of darkness lurks. This interplay between light-hearted surface and possible darkness beneath extends to the phenomenon of childlike characters or comedic sidekicks harboring menacing undertones. Consider certain characters in older cartoons who appear friendly but occasionally flash a diabolical grin or show a flicker of malicious cunning. Animators or storytellers might have included these moments as comedic or edgy jokes, not expecting deeper significance. The watchers, on the other hand, collect these instances as evidence that creators occasionally thread in adult-level creeps. Another factor is that old cartoons frequently used classical horror motifs. Scenes of haunted mansions, skeletons dancing, or transformations into werewolves found their way into comedic cartoon specials. The watchers interpret them as bridging the comedic with the macabre, slyly introducing children to the concept that behind laughter can lie fear. This tension fosters a special brand of uneasy nostalgia. Grown-ups revisit such scenes with the realization we laughed as kids, but the underlying theme was genuinely grim. Thus, haunted pages and flickering screens underscores how many beloved childhood stories, be they fairy tale or cartoon, hold deeper mysteries or darker spins. Why do these narratives endure generation after generation if they contain seeds of fear? Possibly because fear, in measured doses, functions as a moral or emotional primer. Fairy tales become frameworks for children to grapple with the existence of evil or adversity, eventually leading to growth or caution. Meanwhile, older cartoons, by dipping into surreal or haunting visuals, expand a child's imaginative range, giving them glimpses of the unknown while still offering comedic relief. The watchers see it as a vital aspect of story tradition that safe illusions or sanitized illusions can overshadow a primal sense of dread that helps us appreciate triumph over adversity. Yet for certain readers or watchers, the illusions are insufficiently safe, and the older, raw form of these tales can shock them anew. We might also reflect on the moral dimension. Older tales rarely sugarcoat the consequences of wrongdoing or gullibility. In The Little Mermaid, the original Hans Christian Andersen text, the mermaid's heartbreak ends in her dissolution into sea foam, lacking a cheerful romantic resolution. Rumpelstiltskin revolves around a cunning being demanding a firstborn child. The watchers read these as cautionary tales about bargains with the unknown or the price of illusions. The audience, particularly in older times, was not purely children, but the entire community. Over centuries, publishers recast them as children's stories, but the watchers maintain that in doing so, we bury the intense moral or existential dread once integral to the tale's effect. Even so, fragments remain, enough to produce that uneasy feeling we sometimes get when we re-encounter a kid's classic with adult eyes. The watchers point out that this tradition never fully ended. Even contemporary family films occasionally dabble in tear-jerking or horrifying plot points. Coraline, for instance, though pitched as a children's story, revolves around a monstrous being who steals children's eyes and replaces them with buttons. Chilling concept indeed. Or certain episodes from whimsical series might take a sudden turn into emotionally raw territory. That balance between lighthearted innocence and underlying tension is a hallmark of effective storytelling. It ensures that the story resonates across ages, each viewer picking up different layers. But for watchers specifically seeking the dark underbelly, these glimpses confirm that the line separating kids' entertainment from horror can be surprisingly porous. Indeed, many adult watchers recall that a certain cartoon scene or fairy tale passage once triggered nightmares in childhood. Over time, memory dulls the impact, but the watchers revisit it, analyzing how the scene's style or subtext was truly macabre. One might ask if parents or educators are aware of or unsettled by these hidden truths. Some do object or call for Baudelarization. Historically, the drive to sanitize older tales into modern Disney feed or pastel storybook forms was precisely to protect children from perceived traumatic or adult content. That's why, in common retellings, Cinderella's stepsisters do not hack their feet. Snow White's stepmother rarely demands a heart in a box, and the monstrous violence of older cartoons gets trimmed or toned down. Even in that sanitized shape, the watchers note that elements of creepiness can remain. For instance, they see how Pinocchio still has that donkey transformation scenario left in many versions, though softened, or how a comedic cartoon might lighten the grim ending but retains enough gloom to spark childlike terror. The watchers find it fascinating that no matter how many layers of sugarcoating we add, we cannot entirely remove the primordial fear that gave these tales their core. In the end, Haunted Pages and Flickering Screens reveals how childhood media across centuries is not monolithically sweet or harmless, but often layered with subtle horror or moral severity. That we as a culture keep returning to these narratives suggests a deep psychological need to face primal anxieties in a controlled environment. Whether it's the original Brothers Grimm or vintage cartoons with skeleton dances, these stories function as a rite of passage, teaching us that the world can be frightening but also navigable. Modern watchers, gleaning the older or truer versions, realize they stand at the threshold of a dual experience: the nostalgia for simpler childhood illusions and the shock of discovering how intense the source might be. Some watchers find that disparity enthralling, others disquieting. Either way, it underscores how the line between safe child's tale and nightmarish cautionary epic can be paper thin, bridging generations of authors, animators, and storytellers who use the darkness under the bright facade to speak to something essential about the human condition. Thus, the next time you leaf through a battered copy of a nursery rhyme or revisit an old cartoon short, pay attention to the flickers of gloom beneath the pastel images. Notice the abrupt moment of violence, the squeak of fear in a clownish villain's laugh, or the silent terror behind a seemingly benign storyline. That single thread might lead you to the older incarnations, the raw forms that were never truly intended to coddle. And in that confrontation with the older, more fearsome shape, you might experience a new appreciation for these children's classics, that they endure not only because they are sweet, but because they reflect truths about darkness, conflict, and the unknown that all of us must face. We might prefer illusions of total innocence, but the older versions remind us that illusions can break, and what remains might be the raw lesson about survival or moral consequence. So, while we can cherish the comforting modern retellings, we can also acknowledge that behind their cheerful veneers lies a tapestry of sinister edges, a hush of real fear that gives them deeper staying power. And that hush might be the key to why children's stories can remain haunting well into adulthood, bridging the intangible line between daydream and nightmare.